Hey everyone, my name is Varansika, here again with another video. Today we're going to look at a pretty boring problem. Today we're going to be looking at our first writing system problem. Woohoo! A Saharan sensation from the 2023 NACLO Invitational Round. Since this is the first writing system problem, the tools you can use to solve one of these is much clearer, but also a lot more technical than it can be with other types of problems, which basically means before going into the problem, we're going to do a quick overview of various types of writing systems. Now, if you're familiar with terms like abugida, syllabary, and boustrophedon, then you can skip to the timestamp on screen right now that I definitely currently know and totally did not add in while I was editing. Otherwise, let's get straight into it. So first of all, writing systems can be classified into four or five, okay, we'll say 4.5 types. The first of these types, the major types, is an alphabet. So an alphabet is basically a type of system where each glyph, which is basically a fancy word for a letter, corresponds to a single sound within the language. So obviously English uses the Latin alphabet, which is in fact an alphabet, given the fact that it uses the word alphabet in the name. English doesn't quite have the thing of each letter in the script corresponds to a single sound because English sucks, but usually in other scripts you will have something closer to that where each letter is exactly one sound. Something that you will have commonly in alphabets, though, is something called digraphs or also trigraphs. A digraph is basically a combination of two different letters that, when put together in a certain way, represent a different sound. So in English, a good example of this is the fact that the letters C and H put together like this, or T and H, represent the ch and th sounds, and there isn't another way of representing those in English. And then trigraphs are just the same thing, but with three letters instead of two. I can't really think of anything like that in English, though. So some other examples of notable alphabets include the Greek alphabet. Again, you have the Latin alphabet used for a bunch of languages, including Spanish, German, French, and whatnot, and the Russian alphabet. Usually, when it comes to NACLO problems, you won't see a lot of straightforward alphabets. Note the word straightforward. If you do see an alphabet, it's going to be something with really convoluted rules for converting from spelling to pronunciation, sort of like English, but at least something that completely, fully applies the basic principles of one sound, one letter. You're not really going to see that because, well, that would be too easy, right? The next major type of writing system, which is kind of a half writing system because it's debatably distinct from alphabets, is the abjad. And an abjad is basically just an alphabet, same concept, except you have no distinct letters for vowels. You just kind of look at the bunched together consonants and you hope that you know the language well enough that you just kind of fill in where the vowels are. This may sound like a pretty horrifying existence and a way to write things, but if you do think about it, if you are familiar enough with the language, then you can kind of fill in the gaps. For example, if you know what this is supposed to represent, then it's not too far-fetched to figure out what it like actually says. And same thing with these kind of things over here. Two notable examples of abjads used in the real world are the scripts for Arabic and Hebrew, and then there are some other ones too, like the Tavinog script for some Berber languages and stuff like that. The next type of writing system we have, which is much more fully distinct from alphabets and abjads, is the abugida. This one's a bit harder to explain, so I'll use one of the most common examples of an abugida in the real world, and that's the Devanagari script used for Hindi. Basically, in languages and in scripts, there are these things you'll find called diacritics, which is basically markings that can be placed on top of various letters in order to modify some phonetic aspect relating to that letter. Basically, how abugidas work is that you have a basic letter for a consonant that typically has kind of default vowel after it that is represented inherently by that consonant letter, and you can change what that default vowel is by adding diacritics next to the letter for the consonant. And you can also indicate other things about the syllable, like what consonant is at the end of the syllable, like in these examples. So you can see here in Hindi, we have this letter right here, this first one, that on its own represents the syllable ma, so an M sound followed by kind of a sound. But if you add this vertical bar diacritic after it on the right, then you get ma. so it changes the vowel to an a. Similarly here, you do a similar thing with the southern U diacritic, you get mi, and here you get me, you get mo and mu, and you see how the pattern goes. And then these other things that don't add a vowel, but instead add consonants after the vowel, that little dot adds a MN kind of sound. And these two dots that look like a colon add an H kind of sound. Also, because of Sanskrit influence in Southeast Asia, there are a lot of scripts in Southeast Asia and, of course, in South Asia that are also abugidas. It's not uncommon that you'll see a script from Southeast Asia if in the problem itself you get a clue that the script you're working with is from Southeast Asia, you can be reasonably sure that it's an abugida, and that gives you a lot of clues on how to go about solving the problem. So you can see here we have Thai, also a script for a language spoken in Southeast Asia, and it's also a notable example of an abugida. The next major type of script, kind of similar to abugidas, is syllabaries. So whereas the combination of a letter for a consonant and a diacritic in an abugida or them on its own would represent an entire syllable. In a syllabary, each type of syllable gets its own distinct letter. So Japanese is a good example of this. Granted, this sentence, which is closer to how it might be written in formal Japanese contexts, this sentence isn't entirely on its own a syllabary because Japanese sucks. Japanese is actually more of a mixed system. It loans characters from Chinese, which we'll get into a second. That's a different system. But if you were to write Japanese in a purely kind of syllabary format, it would look something like this. So in this format, each letter represents on its own a syllable. One thing you can take away is that when a language is a syllabary, it tends to have very simple phonotactics, which basically means that the syllable structure that you often see in the language is very simple. Japanese is a good example of this. In Japanese, you'll often have syllables consisting only of consonant followed by vowel, then consonant, then vowel, and so on and so forth. That is one clue when you're working with a syllabary, is that if you're working with a language that seems to have a fairly simple syllable structure, something like consonant, vowel, blah, 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 you can have a sort of hunch that you could be working with a syllabary. That same line of reasoning, by the way, applies to if you're working with an abugida and a problem too. Another important thing that I like to go off of when I'm identifying whether the script that I'm working with in a language, in a problem, is an abugida slash syllabary, because they're kind of related, or an alphabet slash abjad, is if the script you're working with is an alphabet, then the number of glyphs you can identify in the language will generally be more than the number of phonemes, the sounds that you actually get from it. Whereas for abugidas and syllabaries, the number of glyphs will be less than the number of actual sounds in a word. This isn't, to be clear, like an actual hard and fast rule. It's just something that I like to go off of, and hopefully sometimes it can speed up the process of solving the problem. Now, the last major type of writing system out there is a logography. In a logography, basically each glyph represents an entire word on its own, right? So one of the best examples of this among modern languages would be Mandarin, basically, and the other Chinese languages related to it. Basically, in Mandarin, each glyph more represents a word. These days, in modern Mandarin, you'll often have words that consist of more than one glyph. So it's not quite, it's not so easy to kind of analyze it the same way anymore. But perhaps a more kind of solid example of a logography in history would be Egyptian and Mayan hieroglyphs, right? So oftentimes Egyptian and Mayan hieroglyphs had single glyphs that on their own would represent entire longer kind of words. Generally, you're never going to see pure logographies in an IOL or NACLO or what any linguistic Olympiad problem, just because, let's say, this Meroitic script from a Saharan sensation was in fact a logography, then each of these things on the left would just be a single glyph, and the problem would basically be unsolvable. There are also systems that are mixed, as in that have features both of one system and also like some other system, or of multiple systems. Japanese is, of course, a good example of this. It has some borrowed Chinese characters, making it, in a sense, a mixed logography and also kind of a syllabary at the same time. So it is possible that when you're working with a script problem, you end up with a couple logograms here and there, and you get that kind of mixed thing, adds a little spice to it. But generally, you're not going to see a pure logography on a linguistic Olympiad puzzle. So that's it for the main types of writing systems. There's also another system out there called a featural system, which is literally only Korean does this. And I could go into how it works, but I think this is a good opportunity for you to do some browsing on Wikipedia and research it on your own. And I'm definitely not saying this because I'm lazy. So with types of writing systems out of the way, we can get into another major typology thing, which is direction of writings, right? So if you're a native English speaker, you may take it for granted the fact that when we write in English, we start on the left side of the page, then each letter we add on to the right and we slowly move to the right. And when we run out of space on the page, then we go below and write the same direction, and so on and so forth. That we call left to right writing direction. That I believe is the most common way in which the direction in which writing systems kind of write their letters. But systems that go right to left do exist. So Arabic and Hebrew, our two abjads from before, are good examples of this. As you can see, they kind of have this indent on the left side. That's not actually an indent, more of just when writing Arabic and Hebrew, you would start on the right side of the page, then progress over to the left, and then when you've reached the left side of the page, you would go below, start from the right, and then go to the left and just keep going. It may seem surprising or odd if you're a speaker of a language that uses a left to right writing system, but there are in fact quite a few languages out there that do in fact go right to left. At this point, you might be asking, but Varin, if I can go left to right and right to left in my writing system, could I go top to bottom as well? To which I say, allow me to introduce you to the wonderful world of Mongolian. So that's right, Mongolian is indeed written top to bottom. I believe it is the only script out there that uses this, although if there is another, do feel free to let me know in the comments section. Now, another major kind of writing system related quirk is something called boustrophedon. Boustrophedon is basically alternating your writing direction while you're writing on each new line. Basically, what I mean by that is, let's say English were written in boustrophedon Latin script, then I would start on the left side of the page and I would just write as usual in a typical left to right system. Except then when I get to the next line, instead of starting going down and then starting on the left side, going towards the right again, this time I would mirror all of my letters, start from the right side, and then go towards the left as if I'm suddenly writing in the way they do in Arabic and Hebrew. And then on the line after that, I would again switch back to left side and write in normal standard English. One good example of this, I believe, is Latin, which did at some point used to be written in boustrophedon. Usually when it comes to NACLO problems, determining boustrophedon won't actually be relevant to the problem unless you're dealing with a large block of text. As you can see in this problem, we are in fact not, so you don't need to worry about that. Just something to keep in mind for the future if you're doing a problem where you actually are looking at a block of text. So now that we've covered most of the major things that have to do with writing systems, at least at a basic level for solving writing system problems, we're now ready to dive straight into the problem. And so we'll just kind of look at what we have here. It's basically a matching problem. On the right, we have these words here transcribed from the actual writing system itself into English. And then we have to correspond these transcriptions to the Meroitic things on the left side. And then once we've done that, we need to basically transcribe into the Roman alphabet these Meroitic words at the bottom over here. Now, using the few rules of thumb I mentioned earlier, there are a couple of things you can do here. One is you can notice that all of the words have a relatively simple structure of consonant, vowel, that kind of thing. And like I mentioned earlier, usually when you have a structure that simple, it's possible that you end up having a syllabary-like system. This is also backed up by the other rule of thumb that we have, which is that generally the amount of glyphs in each of these words tends to be smaller than the kind of maximum number of glyphs that we see in another word, right? So what's the maximum number of glyphs that we can reasonably kind of discern in a word? It would probably be in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then the longest word here we have is like, what is that, 9 glyphs or something? So on average, it seems the Meroitic script words are probably smaller than their Roman counterparts, which means that we can guess that this is a syllabary or an abugida, something like that. Again, because those things I mentioned are just rules of thumb, we can't treat them as like definitive yet, but we can just keep them in mind as we go along. So now we'll get started. Because this is a matching problem, we're going to start with a basic game of counting as usual. we're going to take a basic kind of anchor point that we can use, some sort of feature in the Roman side of things, and then try to correspond that to a similar feature occurring on the left side in the Meroitic words. There are multiple options you have here. I'm just going to go with one of them, obviously. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at all of the words that start with the letter A, right? So we have A anata, C apote, we have F ata, and G apedemaka. And so what we can do here is we can look at the starts of the Meroitic words, and we can look for a feature that occurs once at the start of each word in 4 different words. And then those words are going to be our words that have this ah at the start, and it's also going to tell us kind of what the glyph for ah probably should be. But wait, Varin, you may ask, how do we know what the start of the words is if we don't know whether it's written left to right or right to left? I'm glad you asked, because we really only have to worry about it being written left to right or right to left here. We just check the left side of the word and assume that that's kind of the start of our word, and see if we can find a feature that occurs 4 times. If we do, then great. If we don't, it's probably not written left to right. That or something really weird is going on here. And then we do the same thing on the right side and see if there's a feature we can find that occurs 4 times. If we find something great, otherwise, again, something weird is probably going on here. Now, I'll cut to the chase on this part. You can pause for a moment if you want to try figuring out what the 4 words are and what the writing system is by this strategy. But when we try this, assuming the writing direction is left to right, we don't find any feature that occurs at the start 4 different times. But when we try it going right to left, then we do find exactly 4 words that start with the same glyph, and therefore that must start with the letter A. So this gives us multiple pieces of info. One is that the writing direction is right to left. While we're at it, we can also write that it's probably a syllabary slash abugida, but we're not too sure yet, and that our words that are the ones starting with A are going to be 1, 2, 7, and 10. And then these are going to be anata, apote, ata, or apedemaka. One is that the word ata is the shortest word we have in our corpus on the English side of things. So we can kind of go off a whim here that among 1, 2, 7, and 10, the one that is ata is going to be the shortest of those. Just kind of eyeballing it, we can see that 10 is the shortest of them all. So then 10 is probably F or ATA. Whoa, guys, isn't it so cool how I drew that so fast and definitely didn't take a screenshot? Now, by pretty much the same vein, 1 is the longest of these 4 that we see in our Meroitic corpus, and in our Romanized corpus, the longest we see is Apedemaka, so 1 probably corresponds to Apedemaka. This leaves us with 2 more words that start with an A. One of them is 2, the other is 7. Now, to figure things out here, one thing we can go off of is that anata shares a start with ata and also shares an end with ata. So we can think of it then most likely as the word for anata is going to look similar to this Meroitic word we have here for ata, but with a couple extra glyphs inserted into kind of the middle between these, like, I guess 3 glyphs that we see for the word ata here. And so between 2 and 7, when we look at which one of those looks more like it's just ata with a glyph inserted in between, that would be 7. So we can see that it starts the same way, it ends the same way, and then it has this B-looking thing in between. So we can cross out anata, and we can say that 7 is equal to A. Then, of course, by process of elimination, we have that 2 must also be equal to apote. So now there are a couple things we can do before we kind of move on to the next pathway we can go down. One is that comparing ata and anata, they only differ by 1 glyph. That's this B-looking thing in the middle. And seeing as that 1 glyph on its own basically is representing an entire syllable, we can be fairly sure about our syllabary hypothesis. Now, obviously, it could still be kind of a mixed system. We might see aspects of that later. But basically, on the whole, it's seeming kind of like a syllabary, so we can keep that in mind kind of as we move forward. And of course, be prepared to revise this hypothesis if anything changes. In any case, what it would help to do now, just for the purpose of identifying other glyphs and what they mean, is to kind of break up the things that we have based on the like glyphs that we've identified so far, right? So knowing that this B-looking glyph must be na, we know the thing on the left is ta and the thing on the right is a, this whole kind of two glyph combination that looks like a 52. We can apply that to 10-2, putting a line between the a and ta glyphs, as well as to 1 and 2, where we know which ones are kind of our a. The next thing we can do is following a similar starting letter strategy. We see that in our English side of things, there are three different words that start with a P. There's Pelamosa, Palasana, and Pakara. Now, among the four words that we've identified so far, two of them have a P right after, like a P containing syllable right after the A. First, we have one, which is most likely a Peremaka. We have this E looking thing, followed by a 5, and then all this other stuff. And then similarly in 2, which is Apote, we have the E again, and then a vertical line, and then this weird thing over here. Given this, we can be fairly certain that this E looking kind of glyph likely represents the P consonant sound, which is interesting because it does seem to kind of contradict our observation earlier that this thing is a pure syllabary, because in two different kind of vowel-based syllables, we still have the letter P corresponding to this glyph, but who knows, we'll see kind of where that takes us later. In any case, we have three different words we have to look for that likely start with this kind of E-looking glyph. And when we look through our corpus, we find three of them, in fact. We find 8, we find 9, and we find 12. Now, there are a few approaches we can take here, but the one I'm going to take is that we already know what this B-looking glyph at the end of 9 is. It's the glyph for na. And of our kind of P initial words that we have, only one of them ends with na, it's palasana. So 9 has to correspond to I, which is palasana. Seeing as in here we have seemingly 4 glyphs corresponding to exactly 4 syllables, which does interestingly check out kind of our syllabary observation earlier, we have this glyph, second from the right, which seemingly most likely represents the la syllable. We see that in 8. So obviously Pakara doesn't have that, so 8 has to be Pelamosa. And of course, by process of elimination, we have 12 that must be Pakara, right? And this checks out. If we look at the thing for 12 below, we see 4 3 syllables, we see 3 glyphs, so that seems to make sense. So now we have kind of 5 more things that we can do here, but before we do that, I do want to look at one observation we can make from the words we have so far, specifically in Pelamosa, right? So what we'll notice is that we have this kind of weird, like chair-looking glyph over here that we've established by comparison with Palasana must be our kind of la syllable, and then we have everything before it and everything after it. But what we see here is that in this case, this combination of the 5 looking glyph and the E that we think represents the consonant P or something like that, this represents P. Meanwhile, the glyph on its own here represents Pa. And similarly, when we look at apote, seemingly we have multiple letters here, a Pa kind of glyph, and then a vertical bar representing Po. And then like in Pelamosa, we have the same thing here, where we have the 5 after the P, the kind of E-shaped glyph, seemingly representing Pe in a Peremaka. So what this might seem oddly reminiscent to you of now is Abugidas, where each syllable kind of has a default vowel on its own that's automatically there, and then you can add other things to change what that kind of default vowel actually turns out to be. If this hypothesis is true, then we can say that the default vowel on every syllable, on every kind of glyph, is an A, and then you can add, I guess, a little 5 after it of this 5-looking glyph in order to change that to an E, or this vertical bar-looking glyph to change that to an O. So now that we've kind of written down those observations with the very minimalist tools that we have going here, we can take that and kind of move on to the rest of the problem. One other kind of thing we can eliminate here is that we have pakara. So we have the first syllable in pakara as pa for this glyph. Then we have a kind of ka thing, the Q, qua, I guess, whatever you want to call it. And then we have ra for this U looking or W looking glyph. And then we have E, which is quare, right? So what we're going to expect then is quare will look like this qua looking glyph, and then it'll have the kind of vertical line after it representing the O vowel. Then it will have our W looking glyph representing the ra syllable, and then the 5 after it making it A. When we look for syllables that in fact look exactly like that, we see 6, which literally has the exact structure that we just described. So we can say, therefore, that 6 is going to be E quare. So now on both sides of things, we only have 4 words remaining. Conveniently, 2 of them start with an S. So in the sate, for example, word, we can expect a glyph for the sa syllable followed by a te. And then in sema, we can expect that same glyph followed by a 5 representing se. So we just need to look for those two things. We can start with sate. First, we of course need to figure out what the sa glyph is, just because we haven't really worked with it yet. So we can look at the end of pilamosa in D. Pilamosa, if we recall, corresponds to 8. And we see the last single glyph in 8 is this thing right here, this thing that looks like a 3. So we just need to look for what starts with the 3 and kind of has nothing after, and that looks a lot like 11. So we can guess, therefore, that 11 is sate, H. So now that we find that, we just need to find what the other kind of word is that starts with that glyph followed by a 5. Between 3, 4, and 5, we see that. Wait a minute. So this is interesting, right? Because what you actually will notice is that none of these words starts with a S followed by a 5.
What the heck?
So there are a couple things we can do here from this point. One is basic good old length matching. We know that between the 3 we have left, sema is the shortest, 5 is also the shortest, so 5 is probably sema. And then we can check that against the fact that, okay, we need to look for a kind of syllable representing ma in our other things and see if that checks out with this kind of last glyph we have at the end of 5. We can look in Apedemaka and see that the second to last glyph here is most likely representing ma, because that's the second to last syllable in Apedemaka. It's kind of this crescent moon shaped looking thing. And we do see that at the end of Sema, which is interesting, right? Because contrary to what we've observed otherwise about how the kind of 5 like letter modifies the whole kind of thing, instead we're seeing that the specific syllable se gets its own glyph that looks kind of like the Roman numeral for 7. So what seems to be going on is that maybe it's better to describe this system for the Meroitic script as a mixed abugida and syllabary, that it generally works like an abugida with default vowels and all that, but there are some weird cases where you get entirely separate glyphs in cases where two different syllables actually only differ by the vowel that they contain, and where you would normally expect to see kind of typical abugida vowel modification, but for some reason you don't see that. Instead, you see this. Be wary of that as we proceed with figuring out between the last two that we have here kind of which is which, because if we look for one that is tewiseti, right? So we've seen the syllable representing ta, right? We've seen it at the end of 10 and 7 for ata and anata. It's this thing right here. And again, by the typical abugida pattern, we would expect to see this followed by our 5 looking glyph modifying for the vowel e, but we don't see that in 3 or in 4. In 3 instead we see kind of this thing, and then in 4 we see this. Now, in 4, we know that this kind of glyph that looks like the 3 with the tail below, we know that is ka. That's because we can compare 4 against 1 apedemaka. We know that the ka glyph has to be the last glyph in apedemaka because that's the last syllable, and we do in fact see this. And so obviously 4 has to be karite, and then 3 has to be tewiseti. So it seems like te, for some reason, is another one of those cases where, despite it only differing in terms of vowel relative to the glyph for ta, it actually gets an entirely separate glyph for that syllable. So now we've completed all the matching, and we can write down that kind of last observation we made, that the syllable te also gets a distinct glyph. It's this thing that looks kind of like a, I don't know, like a guy doing like wall sits or something, except he's not actually against the wall for some reason. Okay, why? You know what? Never mind. Look, man, you're just gonna have to accept it. Okay. One other observation we can make in the word tewiseti, corresponding to Meroitic kind of word number 3. We do see a new vowel that we don't see anywhere else. Well, I guess we see it in L, but that's besides the point. We see the E vowel, and so when we look at how the existence of that E vowel modifies what's around it, Well, if we look at what seems to represent T kind of at the end of Tewiseti, we see what looks like the glyph for Ta that we identified by comparison with Ata and Anata. And then we see this additional kind of trident, pitchfork, whatever looking thing, right? We see that for we too, right? So we see this kind of little kind of teardrop shaped overleaf icon looking thing next to the trident, and that seems to represent we. We see it again in Kadite, number 4. That seems to represent D. We can compare it against the kind of D in Apedemaka, seemingly this. And, it checks out, right? So we can say that the trident after the syllable represents the kind of E vowel. With that, we basically have all we need to do the last task, especially now that we finished the matching part of it too. So we can just go straight on and go ahead with that. First, we'll look at word A in the Meroitic script. So we see first this E-looking glyph here, as we established earlier down the process by comparison with Pelamosa, Palasana, and Pakara. That represents Pa, except we have the 5-looking glyph after it, that thing over there. So that therefore has to represent the initial syllable P. Then next we have this W-looking syllable over here. We remember by comparison with Pakara and Kore and other things too, probably, that represents Ra, except it does have the weird pitchfork attached to it. So this is actually Ri, so we can write that down. And next we have our weird guy doing waltzes the totally wrong way, or I don't know, man, maybe it's some new type of exercise. Okay, ask him, not me. And like we recall, that represents Te, so that's our first word, peri Te. Next we move on to B. We see again the same kind of E glyph at the start, which seemingly is Pa, except again here it has the pitchfork attached to it, so this is actually going to be P. Then we look again. We see this thing that looks kind of like a chair. Come to think of it, maybe that's where the guy doing waltzes was trying to go. Like we remember from Palasana, right here. That represents the La syllable, and then it does have the 5-looking thing after it, so it's actually going to be Le. Next we have this looking thing that looks like a crescent moon like we have for Ma, except then there's a vertical line close to it. By comparison with Pakara, that is Ka, except then there is again the 5 after it, so it's actually going to be Ke, Kwe, however you want to pronounce it. Now we move on to C. We see this 2-looking thing and then the 5. Now, this might look a bit perplexing, but you probably hopefully remember from the very first kind of words we matched up that this is actually going to be our glyph, or I guess combination of glyphs, our digraph, if you will, for A, right? So we can compare this against Ata, we see here. Similarly, Anata, we see here. And then Apote and Apedemaka have the exact same thing. So that's A. The next thing we see, we recall that this is for Ta, like in Ata and Anata, so we start with Ata, exact same as one of the words we have. Then we have the W-looking thing for Ra, and then the trident attached to it, making it Ri. Oh hey, it's Atari. Next, moving on to D, we go over here, we have this crescent moon-looking thing with no vertical line next to it. As we recall from Sema and Apedemaka, that is Ma. Then it again has the 5 attached to it, so that's actually going to be Me. We look here, we see this weird kind of ribbon, or alternatively headless guy running looking thing. We compare that against Kadite over here, and De in Apedemaka over here. We establish that that is Da, and then it has the 5 after again, so that's going to be De. And then this, I mean, it's the exact same as the glyph we have from Tewiseti, but this is going to be We, right? It's the overleaf icon thing, and then the pitchfork, that's We. And with that, we have finished our first semantic oh, wait a minute. And with that, we have completed our first writing systems problem. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I hope my kind of long yap about writing system types wasn't too boring. As always, be sure to like and subscribe to the YouTube channel and share this with others who you think might be interested in this kind of stuff. And if you have any problems you'd like me to go through in the future, be sure to let me know. And I'll see you guys next time.